حلقة نقاش نحو عقد السلام أو عقد الحروب. تشارك في استضافة الحلقة صحيفة The National، ويدير الجلسة السيد مصطفى الراوي رئيس التحرير المساعد في The National، وأدعو أدميرال روبرت هارورد الرئيس التنفيذي لشركة لوكهيد مارتن الشرق الأوسط، السيدة دانيال بليكا نائبة الرئيس الأولى لمعهد أمريكان انتربرايز لسياسة الخارجية والدفاع، السيد رولف إيكيوس الزميل المشارك في برنامج سيبري لنزع السلاح، دكتور إيرينا زافاشليسكايا رئيسة معهد ومركز الاقتصاد العالمي والعلاقات الدولية، والسيد مايكل سينغ المدير الإداري لمعهد واشنطن لسياسة الشرق الأدنى.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us. This session is the Security Discourse towards a decade of peace or a decade of wars. Allow me to introduce our esteemed panel. To my left is Admiral Robert Harward. Did I get that? Harward? Chief Executive for Lockheed Martin Middle East. At the end is Michael Singh, Managing Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We also have next to him Dr. Irina Zvyagelskaya, who is the head of the Center for the Middle East Studies at Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, and Ambassador Rolf Ekeus, Associate Fellow with the SIPRI Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Program, and of course Danielle Pletka, Senior Vice President, Foreign and Defense Policy, American Enterprise Institute. So we're going to have a discussion for about 40 minutes about the outlook for security in this region. Perhaps these last few weeks and months in particular have been quite a colorful backdrop for us to have this conversation. Many things have occurred both in the Gulf and beyond it, shifting powers, their roles, whether the US, Russia, and even Turkey now with their adventurism, if you like, in Syria at the moment. So there's plenty of things to get into, as well as perhaps the trends for what might be the theaters of war and the technology that might impact them over the next decade. So thank you for your time and for being with us. Dr. Irina, maybe if we can start with you, perhaps, if that's okay. Could you tell me that in terms of how developments have been with counterterrorism and ISIS over the last few years, as we look ahead to the 2020s, counterterrorism may not quite be the unifying activity that it has been, and perhaps why that has been, and if that's going to continue to be the case?
Well, thanks a lot. I believe right now it's high time to speak about ISIS again. You know what's going on in Syria right now. So to start with your question, I believe that, to be frank, counterterrorism has never been a unifying factor. Well, it's true that there was a certain cooperation in Syria, including, but mostly on deconfliction, if you take Western coalition and Russia. Well, to a certain extent, it was also important, but the problem is that actually there were other tensions, bilateral tensions, which were domineering the agenda of the Middle East, and Syria in particular. And I believe if there were hopes from the very beginning that probably when Russia introduces its forces in Syria, we will be able to fight together terroristic organizations like ISIS first and foremost, it unfortunately proved invalid because the global agenda, which was very negative, was still imposing its own rules of behavior upon different actors. Thank you.
You mentioned Russia's involvement in Syria. How does that, in your opinion, play out over the next few years?
Well, I believe it played out perfectly well. And the best proof is that President Putin is coming here.
That's a difficult answer to argue with, but in terms of how it might impact, if any of the other panelists have a point of view, please jump in.
I'll almost take the contrarian view. because I have seen counterterrorism as a unifying effort, especially in this region. Because I think that there's been the realization that many of the nation states here face now two existential threats. Rising state powers such as Iran, but the ideology behind this terrorism very much poses an existential threat, and they realize that, and at times, one is probably more likely and probable than the other, and hence, that becomes a unifier in the fact that these nation states and us, the US and the European Union, can share intelligence, can plan together, keep a dialogue going, have military cooperation to deal with this existential threat. So I see it a little bit differently than the doctor, and I think those lifelines we've built because of that expand into other elements, and they bridge some of this gaps between both of the existential threats and help build those relationships. I would say from a US perspective, you can see the marked difference between our previous administration and this administration, and the great hope of what happened when it transpired. This great belief that this administration would be more forward-leaning, and they were. Now, after 3 years, that's waning somewhat and challenging some of these partnerships and this relationships, but I still think it's an essential component to leverage to maintain those partnerships and this cooperation where we can and have like-minded entities dealing with it, so we can face any of those challenges beyond that.
Sorry, please.
Thank you. Let me first thank Ragida for having me, because you've done a great job, Ragida, really. Absolutely. I hope she hasn't disappeared. There you are. I agree with you, Admiral Harward, to a certain extent, but I do think that part of the challenge for us, for all of us, not just the Americans, but all of us who have been part of, we can call it whatever we want, counterterrorism. We can describe it however we would like to, whether it's opportunism or it's mission-oriented. But we're reaching an end of that, not for good reasons, perhaps, in the case of the White House, as I think we have all discussed repeatedly over the weekend, but we're reaching an end of it because it doesn't work. It's not a hugely effective tool by itself. Counterterrorism, with the limited objective of either destroying groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, whatever it may be, including Iranian-sponsored terrorism, with that objective doesn't work, because what happens is you say mission accomplished, famously, and then you walk away, as we're about to discover in Syria, and what happens? It comes back. These are not sustainable strategies. There has to be something that underpins counterterrorism that actually is the follow-through, right? That is, as General Petraeus would say, right, that you can have the clear, you can have the hold, but if it's not followed by the build, you're just going to have to start clearing again, and that's been the cycle that we are trapped in the Middle East right now.
And any hope that we might break that cycle?
I don't see the United States having this conversation at all. You had an administration that in the George W. Bush administration that got into the post 9/11 conflicts, whether you like that or not, and did not find a satisfying way to extricate itself. We elected a president that said he was going to end wars, and then we elected another president that said he was going to end wars. Ending wars isn't a thing. Wars are won and wars are lost. When you end them, effectively, you are losing. Donald Trump hasn't quite figured that out yet, but he will soon. And I don't think that the conversation about backfilling with any kind of soft power, economic development, political change, or the things that actually cause that clear and hold to be sustainable is happening in any serious way in the policy community.
Thank you. If I could broaden out the scope of the discussion beyond counterterrorism to perhaps some of the threats that have been with us longer, such as the nuclear threat. Ambassador Ekeus, if I could bring you in here, do you feel that as we go into the 2020s, that the discussion around nuclear threats, nuclear ambitions, state actors, that's something that continue to be very much on the horizon?
No, very much so, and I was slightly surprised when I heard this brilliant group before us talking about European security, and no one mentioned the INF Treaty, that the treaty which is preventing intermediate range missiles from, I would say, fundamentally Russia towards European Union states. That is a remarkable thing when the President of the United States decided to cancel that treaty, which opens up who are those who will be which are the subject for these weapons. It's the United States, European allies. I think that's a bigger threat than any of the other threats mentioned towards Europe. And I think this is, to me, quite remarkable, that European Union reaction. I mean, myself, I'm from Sweden, and of course, we are also now, even if we are not NATO, we are definitely under the 500 to 5,000 kilometers range weapons. And the reaction in Europe has been totally passive. Where is the leadership in Europe on that very fundamental issue? I was with Bill Perry when this was announced, and both of us were shocked when we heard nothing from Europe as a reaction on that. Of course, so that is obvious, and another European, then I go quickly to the region, just one little thing, that is of course the nuclear posture review. The new US nuclear posture review contains, now we will have tactical nuclear weapons, now we will use nuclear weapons to respond to a conventional attack. That means that the nuclear weapons, the small nuclear weapons, of course, more and small, they be roughly the size of Hiroshima, Nagasaki type, but slightly smaller maybe. That means that the probability of use of nuclear weapons have radically increased during this Trump administration. And of course, we will come back, I guess, to Iran, and I will be very happy to develop my ideas there.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Iran, and in this region, and perhaps we can bring Michael Singh into this, we dealt with what appeared to be the biggest risk to the region in the past decade, which was the Iran nuclear risk. Yet we've discovered that other weaponry, other missiles, other threats, whether they be ballistic or cruise or drones or otherwise, are actually more of an immediate danger. So how do we avoid ending up maybe focusing too much on one particular threat and not catching it all, I guess, whether it's Iran or other non-state actors?
Well, look, the JCPOA, which was negotiated under the previous administration, was, I think it's maybe not too bold to say that for the Obama administration, this was both an attempt to deal with what it perceived as a nuclear threat from Iran, but also maybe a way to extricate the United States from the Middle East. And what is maybe more difficult to explain is that President Trump shares that desire to find an exit from the region, but has obviously taken a very different approach towards Iran and to the JCPOA in particular, tearing it up and then engaging in this maximum pressure campaign. I do think, though, that ultimately what recent events show is that the United States can't really shelter itself from the effects of what happened in this region. It may be that we can avoid over-intervention or overextending ourselves. But even if we are going to say, well, now we have priorities elsewhere, China, Russia, for example, we'll need to find a sustainable way at a cost that is reasonable in supporting our partners of safeguarding our interests in this region. And if you look at the challenges which have come up recently, it is things like these emerging technologies like cruise missiles, drones, and so forth, but it's also old threats like terrorist groups, ISIS, and so forth. And it's even sort of very traditional problems like tensions with an ally like Turkey, where we may disagree over the right approach to a particular geopolitical problem in the region.
I mean, it feels like there's a catch-22 where if the US isn't engaged in the region, then the region is in danger. But by engaging in the region, it brings more danger. Dr. Irina, if I can ask you, is the Russian approach, now that Russia has decided it's going to be engaged here for a long time, would the Russian approach create similar complications?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that when we believe that Russia is ready to engage for a long time, it's not exactly what Russia is willing to do in the Middle East. Because a lot of things which were done was a sort of reaction to what Middle East countries were longing for. And they were longing for a check and balances system. Because, as you know, not many of them were very much sure what the United States is going to do next. And under the circumstances, they believed that Russia could be a sort of balance to deal with the United States as well, as you understand. So that is why I believe that there was no strategy to stay here. But I don't know how long Russia will be in the Middle East. Hopefully not militarily. But if we come back to most practical things like trade, like economic exchanges, like investment, like oil, then I believe there is a keen interest also on the part of Russia and on the part of other Middle East states.
So, Admiral, if I could bring you in here, do you believe that there is this sort of checks and balances by having Russian presence, expertise, weaponry, technology as a major player in the region, or should it just be the US?
Well, listen, it's always about influence. I'll tell you a story. If I start, one of my very senior Emirati leadership member of the team here, we trade grandchildren stories. And his granddaughter's 5 years old in a public school here. And what language is she speaking? Mandarin Chinese, that she's learning in the public school. So again, being here is that influence, not for now, short time, it's for the long term. So I think sometimes we lose sight of that, and we forget, of course, how important these partnerships are until you're in times of en extremis. So I think that's the challenge. What footprint, what influence do we want to have to shape the outcome? And I think sometimes our political process loses sight of that. I think that's what we're seeing when we see Brexit, when we see the US, we see in politics. We're losing sight of how part in those global partnerships and that influence, not just for war, but for some of these bigger issues that we're going to need in the long term, which may be as much existential threat, global warming. So those partnerships, that influence, I think is essential, and any great nation understands that and wants to be a part of that.
Danielle, do you think the 2020s is going to be competing influences in this region swirling around in terms of security and how the dynamic plays out?
Well, that's certainly been the history of the region, hasn't it? And I don't think we have any reason to believe that it's going to stop. What I would say is that traditionally, what a country that enjoys a partnership with the United States, that has U.S. forces there, has a hope and an expectation that would add stability. When we were talking at lunch today, and we were trying to figure out, is the president's decision on Syria like Suez, or is it like the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, or which particular time that we scuttled away in the hope of saving ourselves from your travails here, did it most remind us of? But of course, what you can say when you pick each single one of those things is, we're always back. I think that it's very interesting to hear what Dr. Irina says about the Russians. The Russians, of course, are not interested in coming and to my mind, in any case, with respect, in not interested in coming and bringing stability, unless you like the stability of the grave. They are interested in the opportunity that it has afforded them, and we have been very generous in giving them that opportunity through our own missteps. But the issue you bring up is nonetheless, even setting aside this question of conflict, is a very interesting one. because we do not conceptually think about competition in the region in a very serious way. We are able to do it when we look at the sale of the S-400 to Turkey or the sale of the S-400 to the Iranians. Then we think about competition and we think about the threat that's posed by advanced weapons systems supplied by our adversaries. But we don't think about providing a kind of a competition in the political sphere. We don't think about, for example, competing with the Iranians. We have never thought about that. And I would say that that's a problem in the region as well, although it's been very interesting to me to watch as during the Obama administration, the United States retreated, and I think Mike is completely right. That was the Obama's way of, the Obama team's way of walking away, that both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have both actually decided they need to compete in this sphere with the Iranians. And I think it's a work in progress. I wish that we were doing more of that, but in the absence of that, I do see the next decade as one of conflict, not one of competition.
As much as I'd like to set up a response from Dr. Irina for the Russian-US, I'd also like to hear from the ambassador about, not to make him a spokesman for Europe, but given you've seen so many decades in this region, I mean, where do European powers fit into all this? We're talking about Russia, the US, Gulf countries, everybody trying to ensure that they are a bulwark for stability and peace, and how does Europe help without making things worse, I guess?
First of all, I think the Europeans are very proud of the JCPOA. That was the European Union deal. Well, US was there around, but if you talk to the Mogherini and other leaders in Brussels, it was we who did it. And then comes Trump and says, to hell with this shit. And that is a terrible blow, because obviously the beauty of that treaty was that it was reasonably well done, and with a reasonably well IAEA engagement, good control. Now that is totally under question. To me, it is clear that this is a terrible setback for Rouhani and his foreign minister, Zarif. The hardline people who are very unhappy with this treaty is given a great gift. Trump is sending over congratulations. This was a shit deal, and that is what is a great, important, influential part in Iran. So that means that we have created, so to say, in this action, we harshen because the US, in addition, had the even harsher economic sanctions on the country. So what is now happening is that Iran is put in a situation. Well, first of all, I will also say that the decision by the United States to reject the JCPOA is a violation of the United Nations Charter, because that JCPOA was adopted by the Security Council under binding rules. So first of all, that was, no one gives bother about US is free to totally ignore the binding Security Council resolution, but so this is an additional. But what this has added is that the, so to say, more normal qualities in Iran are losing out. Now it will be hardship back. And that will be something that will be the Revolutionary Guard, and that will be Khamenei, and the Rouhani is on his way out. So certainly the security situation and the nuclear security situation has been severely harmed. And this is a matter which the countries around, of course, are suffering. We have still a very, Israel has still the nuclear weapons, and the situation is to be, I think, dramatized. We are facing a very serious situation ahead now in the Gulf because of the JCPOA. And I think it's important that US allies and others try to speak. Well, we will see. There may be new leadership in the US, of course.
We wait and see. in 2020. But the nuclear deal was a triumph for multilateralism, and then now it's been used to beat multilateralism as being a failure. But at the same time, there's this great debate that there are no moderates in Iran, and to think that there are two classes has been a mistake. Yeah. But also now this maximum pressure policy puts everybody in the same boat in Iran. Michael Singh, do you think maximum pressure is going to set us up now for a decade of real conflict with Iran that we can't get out of?
Well, we've had 40 years of conflict with Iran, so assuming that conflict's going to continue, frankly, with or without the JCPOA is, I think, the safe bet. Because look, Iran's objectives in the Middle East are simply not compatible with the sort of strategy and order that we or our allies, like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, envision. So I do anticipate that we'll have that conflict. And what we'll need to determine is how can we use diplomacy to mitigate that conflict where we can, and then how can we use the other tools of our power to contain and deter Iran where it's necessary to do so. And I think that if you're going to say, well, we're only going to use this one tool, whether that tool is diplomacy, sanctions, or war, you're not going to solve that problem. I do want to say just one thing, Mustafa, about this question of European engagement in the Middle East, because I think it sort of deserves a little bit more discussion. I do think that in the past, one thing that American leadership in the region or American engagement in the region has done is it's provided a sort of platform for the engagement of our partners around the world, whether that's European countries, Japan, and so forth. And sometimes those countries have engaged by opposing US policy, as in the case of the Iraq War, for example, although many countries, of course, ended up joining the United States in that effort. Sometimes they've engaged by joining in and supporting US policy, for example, in Syria, where you had British and French forces along with American forces. And I think one of the challenges that American disengagement from the region poses, or American unpredictability in the region poses, is that these other partners around the world are then sort of left without a sort of American initiative or policy to respond to. And you can see that that's thrown a lot of our partners for a loop and made them uncertain, as I think you heard in some of these answers, about their own engagement in the region.
Is the problem that everybody has their own definition of what a partner is in terms of engagement together? The US thinks a partner is one thing, the Europeans another, the Russians another.
Well, maybe. I mean, there's different kinds of partnerships, but I think what has been one of the hallmarks of American engagement in the region is that our partnerships have been enduring partnerships. For the most part. They've been based upon a common sense of a set of interests, a set of threats, and a strategy for achieving them. I think that has been true almost back to World War II. Now, of course, some of those partners have come and some have gone. You know, we were partners with Iran and then we weren't following the Islamic Revolution in 1979. But I think those partnerships have largely been enduring. And so yes, maybe you have some tactical relationships. And I think, frankly, that other powers like Russia and China have engaged more in that way, sort of tactical relationships, and then maybe a backing off or retreat or a relationship on an issue-by-issue basis. But we've had enduring partnerships, and I think those need to be preserved.
So if I ask the panel in general, because from what I'm hearing, it's, as we go into the 2020s, it's kind of same old, same old. I was hoping we could tell people that it's going to be completely different, but it's not. But I mean, in terms of how the security dynamic is going to be set over the next few years, does anyone have an articulated vision or a vision that they want to articulate of how it's going to be? Is it going to be multilateral partnerships? Is it going to be, countries getting together like they have done in the past, or is it everyone for themselves?
I think that's more an issue for the region. How are they going to define? I think you've seen, back to your comment, it is an enduring, if not expanding, partnership with the U.S. and presence in the region. In fact, we're 3 times the size we were on the day of 9/11 of our presence in the region. The same bases we've had then are still here. There are new ones in new countries. So I see that new norm is much different was in the historic. So in that content, we're moving forward. And we've looked for this national coalition. We've been able to do it in the maritime environment. We've been able to do it in the land environment, certain things, but it's the political content in the region that needs to define that so we can support, we can try to lead it. We're not in a position to do that now, and most countries are going in the opposite direction, but I think that's really good to determine those partnerships. It's a political issue for the region.
Would anyone like to add or disagree?
You know, I would say that if in the past, the 80s and 90s, you know, as Admiral Harward was sort of referring to, the United States had a commitment to the region without the heavy presence we have now. And now we have sort of the reverse. We have a heavy presence in the region, but without that sense of commitment. And I think that creates confusion, it creates vulnerability for the United States, because I think we've also given our adversaries the sense that we can be pushed out. And I think the question we need to answer is, what does a U.S. commitment to the Middle East look like in this sort of new framework that we've set for ourselves of great power competition? Is the Middle East a distraction from great power competition, or is it somehow central to American strategy around the world? And if, regardless of which it is, we'll have enduring interests here, and we'll need to lay out a strategy for achieving them. I think if we do not do that as the United States, then I think what we're seeing now in the region, and I'm sorry to be American-centric about this, but what we're seeing now in the region, we will see more of. We will see this sort of absence of a security order, these kind of ad hoc security partnerships that develop, and the opportunism by outside powers, whether it's Russia or Iran or so forth.
Dr. Irina?
Well, first of all, I do believe that we shall still have common threats in the region, and not only terrorist threat as such, but all in all, what we see sometimes the fragmentation of actors within the context of various conflicts. And it means that it is more and more difficult to deal with them. Sometimes, you know, small threats are much more important than big ones, because you can see what you can do with a big one. So from this point of view, I believe it's not only Russia, United States, or Europe, but rather the role of the local powers is getting much more important. And what's more, all of us cannot solve anything in the Middle East without the participation of the local states. And I believe we should rely upon them much more than we did before.
When the Iran-Iraq war ended, the Security Council took a resolution 598, stating in that after dealing with the details, stating that measures should be taken by the United Nations and the Secretary General to enhance security and stability in the region. And I think that is exactly what is now missing. It is not so that you wait on Trump to take the leadership, because he has already started to undermine the stability with his policy on Iran. But it is now a matter for the regional states to take the lead. I could imagine in many issues that, say, Egypt will go back to take the lead from its earlier policy of driving the issue of a zone in the Middle East free from weapons of mass destruction. I could see that the non-aligned countries would, so to say, add up. I think that the Arab Gulf states should look around not to US, because US is treating them in the way it's doing, but they should look to the international community, they should look to the non-aligned states on security issues, which has been quite successful over the years, such cooperation, because many way led by Egypt in cooperation with countries like the Nordic, Sweden and Ireland, Mexico, South Africa, Argentina, and so on. So it's time now for the Arab Gulf to start to have a regional and a global policy on security issues, first of all on the nuclear issue, because the nuclear issue will be there. Now we get a nuclear weapon Iran. That is a probability, of course, if the JCPOA is thrown out. Iran has good quality with their enrichment capabilities, as some of us know, and they will have a very good understanding of ballistic missile policies, and I think there is very little which can prevent them to marry again because of the generous gift by Trump to Iran to not longer be under obligation.
Danielle, you seem to feel that the ambassador, well, I'm putting words in your mouth, the ambassador is instigating an argument here in terms of the US's role in the region.
I have a shocking poker face. Look, it's always tempting, and it always has been tempting to blame the biggest power. And when we are not there, countries are angry with us for not being there, and when we are there, countries are angry with us for being there. I do think it's important to take note of the fact that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is, in fact, what Iran violated, not the JCPOA was a follow-on to their violation of a multilateral treaty that they used to exploit and develop their nuclear weapons program, as did the North Koreans. We didn't do that. They did that. You may not like our reaction to it, but certainly our perception that this was a threat to the region, I think, is one that's shared. I think that there's setting aside the question of whether there are multilateral solutions, which I would suggest is not very likely. I think that the bigger question for us and for the region is how is it going to manage in a new environment? As Admiral Harward said, but as all of us, I think, have alluded to, including Dr. Irina, it is a real challenge. And when President Obama said, rather to my shock, that Saudi Arabia and Iran were just going to need to learn to share the region, as if somehow everybody else should be subjugated to either Saudi or Iranian influence. The reality is that he was actually delineating a competition that exists. And what we've seen is that the response of the countries in the region isn't very effective. If you look at your shared efforts, the Emirates and the Saudis in Yemen, none of us can say that that's been very satisfying. And while I know that the United States is very grateful for the work that the Emirati military has done with us in fighting Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS in Yemen, nonetheless, the outcome has not been positive. And I would say the same has been true when you look at Gulf efforts in Lebanon, in Syria, in Libya. And I don't see General Sisi stepping up anytime to take the mantle of the Sunni Arab world. Mr. Erdogan has taken that on himself, and I think he wants to keep it. And none of those bode well for a future that is a regional future that is, let's say, less influenced by outside powers like the United States, like our friends the Europeans, like others. That's the real challenge ahead for the Middle East.
We have a few minutes left. Does anyone want to make a kind of response to that? Anyone, perhaps from Europe?
No, I think that it's important that the Arab Gulf states really now get together and don't bother about the little problems. They should work together. I mean, look at, if you don't do that, take Gaddafi, who made a deal with the United States and the United Kingdom about the nuclear weapons program, and he gave up all his chemical weapons. He did that. Thank you. What happened? Bolton, the former advisor to President Trump, stated just before he left a reminder to North Korea. Look at what is happening. The Libyan model was perfect, you see. Because we made the deal, Libya gave up its nuclear program, Libya gave up its chemical weapons, and the North Koreans I talked to, as I am in regular contact with North Korea, pointed, so is that what will happen to us if we give up our nuclear weapons? If Mr. Bolton is telling us what will happen?
Sorry, Ambassador, I'll give the last word to Michael at the end.
Thank you, Mustafa. So, look, I worry that we're creating a distinction that doesn't exist in practice, right? I mean, the United States is strongest and is most effective when we're working in concert with the UN, with local partners, and so forth. And that, I think, has been a consistent goal for American policymakers as well as for policymakers from other places. You know, in Syria, it has been US policy to support Geir Peterson, the UN envoy. In Yemen, we have been supportive of Martin Griffiths, the UN envoy. If Sir John sort of advises that the EU is not a country, well, neither is the UN, even less so. And so the UN is only successful to the extent we powers, especially we big powers, give it our support and work through it. So American leadership in the Middle East, I think, doesn't mean unilateralism. Engagement here doesn't mean that we do it alone. It means that we try to be a force that assembles the strengths of other states and responds to the sort of needs of our partners in the region in a way which is good for all of our interests.
So we have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Probably the conclusion is that throughout the 2020s, we're going to continue debating what's going to happen. And I don't think any of us are going to quite agree. But if I could ask the audience to please join me in thanking our panel. It was a very good conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.